What if I told you a federal judge tried to destroy a rising political star, and she fought back and won $800 million in court? This isn't a movie plot. It just happened. Karoline Leavitt took on one of the most powerful men in the justice system and exposed a scandal that could shake the entire judiciary. Buckle up. This story will blow your mind. This changes everything. That was the explosive quote that shattered headlines and echoed across newsrooms nationwide as Karoline Leavitt, former Republican congressional candidate and outspoken political commentator, emerged from the towering federal courthouse in Washington, D.C. Her voice was firm, her stance defiant, and her expression resolute. She had just secured one of the most stunning legal victories in U.S. history, a record-shattering $800 million lawsuit settlement against none other than a sitting federal judge. The scene was surreal, almost cinematic, with dozens of cameras clicking away, reporters shouting questions, and a growing crowd of supporters cheering from behind the security barricades. The moment sent shockwaves across the country. It wasn't just a victory in a court of law. It was a moment of reckoning. A political underdog had stood up against a pillar of the American legal system and emerged victorious. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. In a nation where judges often wield near untouchable authority, the idea that one of them could be held accountable in such a monumental and public fashion seemed impossible. Until now. Within hours, the story dominated every major news outlet. TV anchors interrupted scheduled programming. Online publications ran back-to-back pieces dissecting the case. Pundits, influencers, and politicians from all sides jumped into the conversation. On social media, hashtags like #Caroline wins big, #corrupt bench, and #judicial reckoning trended globally. Memes, video clips, and commentary flooded platforms like X, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Karoline Leavitt had become more than a political figure. She was now a symbol of resistance, of accountability, and of justice pursued against all odds. But the real story didn't start in front of those cameras. It began nearly 2 years prior, in the quiet shadow of a different courtroom. Back then, Leavitt was embroiled in a high-profile defamation case tied to her political career. She was accused of making allegedly false statements during a heated campaign cycle, statements that would come back to haunt her as the case gained national attention. Judge William Corwin was assigned to oversee the case, a man known for his strict demeanor and firm grip on courtroom order. At first, there was little to suggest anything was amiss. But as the proceedings dragged on, troubling patterns began to emerge. Karoline's legal team began raising red flags about procedural inconsistencies. Their motions were repeatedly denied without explanation, key evidence was barred from being presented, and cross-examinations were cut short. It all seemed to favor the opposing side. Behind closed doors, Leavitt began to suspect that this was more than judicial formality. It was personal. The final blow came when a document that could have swayed the case in her favor mysteriously vanished from the court record. It was the moment Karoline realized something was deeply wrong. She decided not to stay silent. What followed was a public accusation against Judge Corwin, whom she alleged had committed serious misconduct, including political bias, tampering with evidence, and even private communications with the opposing counsel. The public reacted with skepticism. Many saw it as a desperate move by a losing politician looking for someone to blame. For a while, it seemed the tide was against her. She was mocked, criticized, and painted as a conspiracy theorist. But Karoline didn't back down. She lawyered up and filed an unprecedented lawsuit against the judge himself, risking everything to prove her claims. The legal community was stunned. No one challenged federal judges like this, certainly not politicians who had everything to lose. Her team built their case brick by brick, claiming the judge's actions had not only destroyed her political career, but violated her constitutional rights in ways that could not be ignored. Her public reputation had been shredded, endorsement deals lost, political opportunities crushed, and she faced blacklisting from major networks and platforms. Then came the game changer. Two whistleblowers, former clerks from Judge Corwin's own chambers, came forward with damning testimony. They revealed a pattern of manipulation behind the scenes. Court documents had been deliberately mishandled, timelines were adjusted to disadvantage Leavitt's defense, and one clerk even claimed to overhear the judge say, "We need to make an example of her." The final nail in the coffin was an anonymous leak of an audio recording in which Judge Corwin could be heard discussing Leavitt's case with a known political donor. The clip sent the internet into a frenzy and turned public opinion sharply in her favor. The trial that followed captivated the nation. Over the course of several months, every development was dissected live on cable news and YouTube streams. When the jury delivered its unanimous verdict in favor of Leavitt, awarding her $800 million in damages, gasps filled the courtroom. It wasn't just compensation, it was a statement that no matter how high your position, you are not above accountability. Karoline's words, "This changes everything," were not a boast. They were a battle cry. In one courtroom, with one case, she had cracked the foundation of what many assumed was an unbreakable institution. Whether history will see her as a hero, a disruptor, or something in between remains to be seen. But one thing is certain. This story is far from over. This courtroom clash began 2 years ago, not with a bang, but with a quiet accusation that would soon ignite one of the most controversial legal battles in recent memory. At the center of it all stood Karoline Leavitt, a bold and vocal political figure, known for her sharp commentary and unapologetic stance on conservative issues. She was no stranger to the public eye, but what she was about to endure would test the limits of her resilience and redefine the boundaries of accountability in the American legal system. It all started during a high-profile defamation case in which Leavitt found herself being sued over statements she made during a heated political campaign. The case was contentious from the beginning, but what made it truly explosive was the conduct of the presiding judge, William Corwin. Almost immediately, Leavitt and her legal team noticed what they described as unusual and deeply troubling behavior from the bench. Motions from her attorneys were repeatedly denied without explanation. Evidence that could have exonerated her was allegedly ruled inadmissible. Deadlines were mysteriously shortened, giving her team less time to prepare their defense. But perhaps most concerning of all were the whispered rumors of private meetings between Judge Corwin and opposing counsel. Meetings that should never have taken place under any circumstances. According to official filings, Leavitt's legal team uncovered indications that Judge Corwin may have gone beyond simple bias. They accused him of outright misconduct, including the alleged tampering of court evidence, the issuing of rulings based not on law, but on political animosity, and the deliberate suppression of key testimonies that could have changed the outcome of the trial. The accusations were serious, even scandalous, and yet at first, the public reaction was muted. Many dismissed the claims as nothing more than political theater, a losing candidate throwing a tantrum and pointing fingers to distract from her own missteps. But Karoline refused to let the story die. In press conferences, she doubled down. On social media, she released cryptic posts hinting at deeper corruption. And behind the scenes, her attorneys were meticulously building a case. They claimed that the judge's actions had not only destroyed her legal standing in the defamation suit, but had also damaged her reputation to the point of no return. Book deals vanished. Media networks that once lined up to interview her suddenly pulled back. Campaign donors dried up. Speaking invitations were rescinded. She was effectively frozen out of the political world that once welcomed her with open arms. Leavitt made it clear that this wasn't just about money or revenge, it was about justice. In her own words, the courtroom became a weapon, not a place of justice. For her, it wasn't only her name on the line, it was the credibility of the legal system itself. She argued that if a judge could abuse their power to this degree without consequences, then no citizen, regardless of status or political affiliation, was truly safe from the long arm of a corrupted bench. Her legal team filed a sweeping federal lawsuit against Judge Corwin, citing constitutional violations, abuse of power, and intentional infliction of emotional and financial harm. They sought not only compensation for the damages done, but also a public reckoning. For a while, the case seemed like it might never make it past preliminary hearings. The legal community whispered about the danger of allowing such a case to proceed. Some warned it would open the floodgates and weaken judicial immunity. Others argued that it was about time judges were held accountable for egregious behavior. Then everything changed when the whistleblowers came forward. Two former clerks from Judge Corwin's own chambers approached Leavitt's legal team with information that would flip the case upside down. They claimed that they had been pressured by the judge to manipulate internal records, delay filings from Leavitt's team, and redact crucial documents. One of them even alleged that the judge had expressed open disdain for Karoline, referring to her as dangerous and a threat to stability. These statements, combined with evidence that showed irregularities in court dockets and inconsistencies in sealed document handling, cracked the case wide open. Suddenly, what was once seen as a political stunt took on a very different tone. The national media began to take it seriously. Legal experts started analyzing the clerk's statements and matching them against public court records. Public trust in the judiciary began to waver as people questioned how something like this could happen in a system designed to be impartial and fair. Karoline Leavitt went from being viewed as a disgruntled loser of a court battle to a potential victim of one of the most significant judicial abuses of power in modern history. The tide had turned. The whispers of corruption became shouts for accountability. And what had started as a seemingly hopeless legal challenge against an untouchable figure of the law evolved into a full-blown national reckoning. A reckoning that would eventually lead to one of the largest courtroom verdicts ever delivered in a personal case. And Karoline, unshaken, kept repeating the same words. This was never just about me. Things took a dramatic and irreversible turn when two former clerks from Judge William Corwin's chambers stepped forward and shattered the silence that had protected the powerful for far too long. Their decision to come forward wasn't just a development, it was a bombshell. What had been widely dismissed as political noise or an overblown conspiracy theory suddenly transformed into a national scandal that rocked the very foundation of the judicial system. These were insiders, people who had seen everything from behind the scenes. And their testimony painted a picture so damning, so deliberate, that even the harshest critics of Karoline Leavitt were forced to take a second look. In a video deposition that quickly went viral, the first clerk, speaking with visible discomfort, revealed that they had been directly instructed to bury exculpatory evidence that would have strengthened Leavitt's defense during her original defamation case. The clerk alleged that memos proving Leavitt's statements were based on verified intelligence and public records were deliberately misplaced, delayed, or flagged as inadmissible without valid reasoning. When asked who gave those instructions, the clerk didn't hesitate. Judge Corwin himself. The second clerk, more composed but equally damning, confirmed the manipulation of court timelines. He described how filings from Leavitt's legal team were quietly delayed and held back from the docket, actions that ensured they would miss deadlines or appear unprepared during hearings. The clerk also testified that Judge Corwin frequently mocked Karoline in private chambers, calling her a media stunt in heels and dangerous for the system. But the most chilling moment came when the clerk recounted an alleged quote from the judge. "She'll never recover from this. I'll make sure of it." That statement, casually delivered behind closed doors, suddenly gave weight to every one of Leavitt's original accusations. As these revelations exploded across the media, what came next would shake the case and the public like a bolt of lightning. An anonymous source leaked a covert audio recording online. Within minutes, the clip spread like wildfire on platforms like X, formerly Twitter, YouTube, and Telegram. In the recording, Judge Corwin was heard speaking to a man later identified as a known political donor and lobbyist with direct ties to several of Leavitt's opponents. In calm, calculated tones, Corwin can be heard saying, "She poses a real threat. If we don't take her out of the game now, she'll only get louder." The conversation, filled with phrases like neutralizing her platform and redirecting the narrative, was less about justice and more about strategy, how to silence a political voice that didn't fit the establishment mold. This wasn't just judicial misconduct. It was something darker, more deliberate. It was judicial sabotage. The very system that was supposed to uphold fairness and impartiality had seemingly been weaponized for political purposes. Overnight, the narrative surrounding the case changed. What had once been spun as a failed candidate crying foul now looked like the early warnings of a political hit job. Public opinion turned like a tide. Supporters rallied online, calling for a full investigation into Judge Corwin's past cases. Civil liberties groups issued statements demanding reforms to protect defendants from this kind of abuse. Legal analysts, once skeptical, began acknowledging that Leavitt might have exposed a systemic vulnerability no one had dared challenge before. The media response was immediate and intense. News anchors ran split screens of the clerk testimonies and audio recording, asking tough questions about how something like this could happen under the nose of oversight committees. Editorials flooded newspapers and websites, many calling this the biggest judicial integrity crisis in a generation. Political figures across the aisle, some previously critical of Leavitt, began walking back their comments. Even former judges and federal prosecutors appeared on nightly panels, agreeing that the evidence, if verified in court, would not only justify the lawsuit, but could lead to criminal charges against Corwin. Karoline Leavitt, meanwhile, maintained a steady and focused presence. She issued a statement thanking the clerks for their bravery and reiterated that her fight was never about personal revenge. It was about protecting the public from unchecked power. She warned that for every story like hers that comes to light, there are dozens that are buried by fear, pressure, or silence. And she was determined to ensure this case would set a precedent. The momentum that followed the clerk's revelations became unstoppable. Petitions circulated calling for Judge Corwin's immediate suspension. Investigative journalists began digging into other controversial rulings from his past. Protesters gathered outside federal courthouses demanding reforms to judicial immunity laws. The public wasn't just watching anymore, they were mobilizing. What started as a lone voice against the system had become a full-blown national movement. The leaked audio and insider testimonies didn't just bolster Leavitt's claims, they validated them in the eyes of millions. And once trust in the system begins to erode at that level, there's no going back. This wasn't just a case of corruption, it was a turning point, one that forced America to look in the mirror and ask itself just how blind justice really is. After 9 long, grueling months in court, the case that had captivated a nation finally reached its dramatic conclusion. With every major network, podcast, and independent journalist covering the trial blow by blow, the pressure in the courtroom was palpable. Legal pundits described the trial as a collision between the untouchable and the unrelenting. On one side stood Judge William Corwin, cloaked in the historic authority of the federal judiciary. On the other, Karoline Leavitt, a defiant political voice who had refused to be silenced, dragged through legal hell but emerging more determined than ever. The jury deliberated for less than 2 days. That alone sent a signal. After sifting through hours of whistleblower testimony, mountains of documents, and the now infamous audio recording where Judge Corwin was heard conspiring with a political donor to take her out of the game, the jurors had heard enough. When they returned to the courtroom, there was silence. Every camera lens zoomed in, every spectator leaned forward. What came next would reverberate far beyond the four walls of that courthouse. The verdict was unanimous. Karoline Leavitt had been wronged. Profoundly. The jury didn't merely find in her favor, they delivered a stunning rebuke of the judge's actions and the system that allowed it to happen. In a clear and powerful ruling, they awarded her $800 million in damages. The breakdown was unprecedented. The court cited malicious judicial abuse of power, career-ending defamation through unlawful actions, and severe emotional and financial trauma as the foundation for the amount. Gasps echoed through the room. Reporters scrambled to update headlines. Outside the courthouse, a crowd that had gathered for days erupted into cheers. Legal analysts on live television were nearly speechless. "This isn't just a payout," one commentator said. "This is a declaration, a shot across the bow of unchecked judicial authority." Another expert described it as a historic moment in the battle for accountability, a reminder that even the most powerful public servants are not above the Constitution. The ruling also shattered long-held beliefs about judicial immunity. Traditionally, judges are protected from lawsuits for their official conduct, even if their rulings are later proven harmful or biased. But this case blew that precedent wide open. The jury had determined that Judge Corwin's actions went far beyond interpretation of the law. They were personal, strategic, and vengeful. The verdict sent a chilling message to anyone in power who might ever consider using their bench as a political weapon. The moment Karoline walked out of that courtroom, the scene was electric. Cameras flashed like strobe lights. Microphones were thrust in her direction. Her legal team flanked her on both sides, but it was Karoline who stood front and center. With a poised smile and tears welling in her eyes, she raised her hand to acknowledge the cheering crowd. Supporters chanted her name, some holding signs that read, "Justice served," and "No more corrupt judges." The footage of her walking down the courthouse steps would become one of the most replayed clips of the year. And then the internet did what it does best. It exploded. Within minutes, hashtags like #Karoline Victory, #Justice for Leavitt, and #Corwin Exposed were trending worldwide. TikTokers posted reaction videos. YouTubers uploaded breakdowns of the verdict, and X lit up with side-by-side images of Karoline entering court under scrutiny and leaving it in triumph. Influencers and political figures who had once kept their distance suddenly voiced their support. "She fought the system and won," one prominent commentator posted. "This is bigger than politics. This is about accountability." In a world increasingly skeptical of institutions, this case struck a nerve. It was about one woman refusing to be crushed by a machine designed to protect itself. It was about exposing the hidden cracks in the system and forcing sunlight into places long kept dark. Karoline's fight resonated with people across party lines, economic backgrounds, and belief systems. Because at its core, it wasn't just about politics, it was about principle. Karoline's team later revealed that the victory wasn't just financial. Part of the ruling included a formal investigation into Judge Corwin's past rulings and the opening of a judicial ethics review committee to oversee similar cases in the future. There were already whispers that the Department of Justice might get involved. The ripple effect was just beginning. As she stood on that courthouse plaza, Karoline's voice rang clear through the chaos. "This wasn't just about me. It was about every citizen who's ever been silenced, every whistleblower who was told to shut up, every victim who was told the system wouldn't help them. Today, that system answered." And as the cameras continued rolling, it became evident that this wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where the gavel no longer falls without accountability. In a moment charged with emotion, history, and vindication, Karoline Leavitt stood before a sea of microphones, reporters, flashing cameras, and cheering supporters outside the courthouse that had just delivered her the most significant legal victory of her life. She wasn't just a plaintiff who had won a lawsuit. She had become a symbol. Clad in a sharp navy suit, her voice steady but passionate, Karoline addressed the nation in what would quickly be called one of the most impactful post-trial press conferences in modern political memory. "This is not just a victory for me. It's a victory for every American who has been silenced by the system," she declared, pausing to allow the words to settle. "Today we proved that no one, not even a judge, is above the law." Her words were met with thunderous applause from the crowd gathered behind security barricades. Some chanted her name, others held signs that read, "We stand with Karoline," and "Accountability now." The atmosphere felt less like a press conference and more like the start of a national movement. But Karoline wasn't just there to celebrate the verdict. She had come prepared with a bold announcement that would mark the next chapter in her campaign for justice and reform. With conviction in her tone, she revealed her plans to launch a nonprofit foundation dedicated to courtroom transparency and judicial ethics reform. The mission of the organization, she explained, would be simple but powerful: to protect everyday citizens from the abuse of legal power and to shine a light on the dark corners of the American judicial system where misconduct, bias, and corruption have long gone unchecked. "This isn't the end. It's the beginning of a movement," she said, her voice rising above the din of cheering. "The foundation will work to expose judicial misconduct, support whistleblowers, and provide legal resources to victims who, like me, thought they were powerless. We're going to change how justice is served in this country." Her announcement triggered immediate buzz online and within political circles. Social media erupted with messages of support. Hashtags like #JusticeReformNow and #Karoline Movement trended across platforms. Prominent activists and civil liberties organizations publicly praised her for taking her victory and turning it into a platform for systemic change. Legal scholars quickly weighed in, noting that the creation of a watchdog nonprofit led by a high-profile, victorious plaintiff could put unprecedented pressure on the judicial system to clean up its act. Meanwhile, Judge William Corwin, the man whose abuse of power ignited this national firestorm, faced the consequences of his actions in real time. While Karoline was addressing the media, reports began to surface that a formal investigation had been launched into his conduct by the federal judiciary's oversight board. Legal experts confirmed that, based on the evidence made public during the trial, including whistleblower testimony and the damning audio recording of Corwin conspiring with a political donor, criminal charges were a real possibility. Prosecutors were reportedly reviewing whether his actions rose to the level of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to defame, and breach of judicial ethics statutes. The possibility of Corwin's removal from the bench seemed not just likely, but imminent. Calls for his resignation flooded the offices of judicial oversight agencies. Several lawmakers released statements urging a broader inquiry into Corwin's past rulings, with one senator demanding that every decision this man has touched must be reviewed for fairness and legality. The American Bar Association, typically cautious in commenting on active matters, issued a rare statement supporting the verdict and pledging to work toward improved safeguards in the judiciary. Across the legal world, a ripple effect had already begun. Judges, clerks, attorneys, and even law students were now having uncomfortable but necessary conversations about power, accountability, and the unseen politics of the courtroom. Courtrooms across the country suddenly felt less immune from public scrutiny. Legal reform advocates, long dismissed as idealists or fringe voices, found new audiences and renewed momentum. Karoline, for her part, seemed prepared to carry that momentum forward. She promised that her foundation's first major campaign would push for legislation requiring all federal courtrooms to implement transparent review processes and to publish judicial disciplinary records, something currently hidden from public view. She also hinted at lobbying efforts to reform judicial immunity laws that for decades have shielded judges from personal liability, even in cases of proven misconduct. The verdict, the press conference, and Karoline's poised yet passionate response to it all marked a shift. Not just for her, but for the country. A single lawsuit had exposed cracks in the foundation of justice itself, and now the nation was watching to see whether change would truly follow. As she walked away from the microphones, smiling with her supporters chanting behind her, it was clear that Karoline Leavitt was not done. Not even close. The courtroom battle was over, but a new war, one for transparency, fairness, and real judicial accountability, was just beginning. And at its forefront stood a woman who had once been silenced, now louder and more powerful than ever. If this story shocked you, just wait. More truth is coming. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss a moment. Join the movement. Your voice matters, and justice is only the beginning.